Welcome to the third episode of
Hypothesize That,
UCB's Science Exploration podcast, where we delve deeply into the world of pharmaceutical research and development. I'm your host, Nicola Hill, and today we're going to be looking at the thought-provoking topic of the future of gene therapy and the notion that patient engagement could eclipse science. We'll explore how the successful development and adoption of gene therapies may critically depend not just on scientific innovation, but on a revolutionary shift towards early and consistent patient engagement and involvement. So sit back, put on those thinking caps while I welcome my guests. We have Laurence Woollard, an independent consultant specialising in rare disease advocacy and policy, and a person living with the rare inherited bleeding disorder haemophilia. Welcome, Laurence.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have Dr. Emma Lane, who is UCB's patient engagement lead in gene therapy. Welcome, both of you. Thank you for joining us today. Now, this is a very bold and rather provocative hypothesis that patient engagement could eclipse science in gene therapy. Perhaps, first of all, we should discuss what exactly is patient engagement in this instance. And I'm actually going to come to you first, Emma. I think maybe this is something you can give us a good explanation about.
Yeah, absolutely. So patient engagement really centres on the idea of working with, alongside patients and patient organisations throughout the drug development process and beyond, within healthcare and throughout the healthcare system, involving and working alongside, co-creating with patients and patient organisations. And that means bringing their voice into very early stages in drug development, into how we develop clinical trials and how we implement those treatments in the healthcare system at later stages.
Now, this is obviously something you're very involved in, Laurence. I'm presuming patient engagement is changing over the years anyway.
Definitely, and following on from Emma, I think we often hear terms like engagement, involvement and participation, so they're often used interchangeably within the literature specifically, but have kind of varying definitions. I certainly think of engagement across a continuum from sort of lower to higher degrees of patients' power of influence and decision-making authority, corresponding with different levels of activity or sort of depth and intensity of that engagement across the drug development pipeline and sort of life cycle, depending on the scope of the activity. To your question specifically, I think there's been a growing understanding that patients have unique perspectives on their treatment and may view issues differently from researchers or sponsors or other actors as part of the drug development process. So, and equally, those preferences may change and evolve over time. So I think it's really important that we are capturing that knowledge and experience from those communities of which we're trying to bring new innovations through.
It's interesting that you say how it is changing and developing. I mean, our hypothesis is that it could actually eclipse science. I mean, maybe both of you very briefly just tell me, do you think that's a realistic hypothesis?
I think it's a challenging hypothesis because the role of the patient has changed so much over the last 15, 20 years. We've gone from them being participants in research and very much viewed as we're doing this for you to being partners in the process. And I think there are instances where patient communities are driving clinical development of new therapies. So they are becoming increasingly not just partners, but drivers of change. And they are so important in the process that I don't think it's an unrealistic hypothesis. I think ultimately we need a balance, but I think we need that driver to ensure that they have a really meaningful seat at the table throughout the drug development pipeline.
Because, of course, gene therapy is, it's very different from just popping a pill. And if it doesn't work, then that's fine. You just change medication, gene therapy is actually affecting your DNA. Is that something that you find, Laurence, that patient groups consider very, very carefully, and you really have to educate them well?
Yeah, and I think that the role of patient engagement is true for kind of all communities, but it's certainly more nuanced for gene therapy because, to your point, the complexity of the science and the kind of associated considerations around safety, efficacy and durability. So I think there's a lot more emphasis, particularly on sponsors and researchers, to apply those principles and practices of engagement with communities of which are a target, for gene therapies.
I was going to say education must be vital in this situation.
I mean, it's absolutely fundamental.
Yeah, and we saw this during COVID, and not to, talk about the past too much, but we must take lessons from the past, and the application of the vaccine programme was really important insight into the importance of education for all communities and making sure that we take everybody on the journey to understanding the science behind new innovations. And with the vaccine programme, we saw a very fast development of very innovative science, and that was applied very quickly to the public. Many people accepted it readily, but there were large communities who really felt left behind in that education process. We need to ensure that when we do engagement, we do that effectively across communities, and that we don't just create more echo chambers, and that we ensure that the education that we provide is suitable across the broadest range of communities we can reach.
Definitely, and I think knowledge and understanding are going to be key factors in the acceptance of undertaking gene therapy, whether in a clinical trial setting or in a kind of post-marketing setting. So I think it is definitely going to be incumbent on scientists, researchers, sponsors, and others involved in drug development to work closely with trusted patient advocacy groups to incorporate current evidence and some of those uncertainties into culturally and developmentally appropriate educational materials, so that we can support individuals and their families in making evidence-informed decisions and choices.
I like the choice of your word, trust. I think that's vital, isn't it?
Completely, and I think that's why patient advocacy groups are absolutely pivotal as part of that, the stakeholders within the health system in terms of supporting the delivery of information. And also, taking account of that kind of cross-section of people as well. I think the, representation in patient engagement is equally important as the act of engagement itself.
Absolutely. And I think the education is a tool in and of itself. If we want patients not just to receive information and be informed, but to be active players in working with the researchers, they need to be fully informed and educated to be able to have that equal conversation with the researchers, with the clinical trial developers, to ensure that that message is transmitted effectively, to make sure that we understand the unmet need in that community, that we can design a trial that's suitable and meets the needs of patients, so that we can design a healthcare system that meets the needs of those patients. But in order to do that, they need the education right from the beginning. They have to be on that journey with us right from the outset.
And presumably, you mustn't give any unrealistic expectations. That must be vitally important.
That's one of the challenges. In working with people very early on, we need to be very open about the likelihood of success and the challenges that we face. Many patient organisations are actually very well equipped to understand that. But we need to take that on a case-by-case basis to ensure, again, that we are honest and open about what we're trying to develop, what stage we're at, and the likelihood of success for this. The benefit is that we are constantly learning and ensuring that that learning is used. So whatever we learn from the patient community is ensuring that that learning is somehow embedded back into the way that we perform our research or the way that others conduct their research, so that there is always a mutual benefit to that interaction, and that we are learning from each other about how we can improve the drug development process, even if that particular piece of development that we're doing is maybe not going to produce the therapy at the end that we hope, because we know that the landscape for drug development is is fraught with challenges and can lead to failure as well as success.
And I definitely think, stakeholders need to take a proactive stance to gene therapy related misinformation, particularly because of the whole piece around therapeutic hype. And I do think we have to be really mindful of using terms like cure and curative to manage expectations. We may see some of these treatments being phenotypically curative, but not necessarily functionally curative. So again, I think that's where stakeholders have to again work together to ensure that the information that's being delivered to communities and co-created with communities, to Emma's point, is very clear, transparent around that benefit risk profile.
It's interesting that you use the word cure then, because I know in the media we read earlier this summer about a gentleman who received gene therapy for a type of haemophilia he had, and he was quoted as saying, well, that's it, I'm cured now. But you're saying we can't definitely guarantee that's the case.
Well, I think we know that there are some, long-term uncertainties that are still associated with gene therapy. So I can understand why the press and the media might like to sort of take that opportunity to kind of showcase some of these new innovations and again some of the phrasing that they might use to kind of generate public interest. And I think the argument always is, particularly from a rare disease lens, that it's better to have that public attention than not. But equally, again, I think it is incumbent and there is a responsibility on researchers, clinicians, and again patient advocacy groups to to kind of challenge some of those reports to ensure that patient communities understand exactly what we know in terms of the current evidence, and as we said, the sort of long-term uncertainties that's still associated by undertaking gene therapy.
I know you don't mind me asking you this question, Laurence, but you have haemophilia. I'm presuming, tell me if I'm wrong, that gene therapy must have crossed your mind. Is it something that you would consider having if there was the right possibility for yourself?
I really appreciate the question. So I think gene therapy definitely represents a paradigm shift in the treatment and care for people living with my condition. And that's in terms of both reducing treatment burden or frequency of either intravenous injections or subcutaneous injections, as well as increasing the threshold of protection from bleeding. As I said, I think it's just kind of being mindful of some of those, of that expectation management and those long-term uncertainties that we've discussed. And equally, I think haemophilia is a really interesting case study because obviously depending on the health system and country of which you live, but if we take the UK, we have very good alternatives. And that's compared to some other rare and kind of orphan condition communities that may not have any treatment available. There isn't equivalence there in terms of standard of care. So I think from a personal perspective, I guess it's always, being able to have that sort of evidence-informed discussion with my clinical team to understand what's best for me. And I think, again, that underpins that whole piece around how I think the decision to undergo gene therapy is going to be an individualised one.
Emma, I know that you've got examples, haven't you, of where patient groups have actually supported and funded research into gene therapy.
There are, and there are some, to put this into context, there are over 7,000 rare diseases. Most of those are, around 80% of those are monogenic diseases where genes are affected. And that means that they are candidates for gene therapy, but they are impacting on a very small number of people. And the finances of that and the number of rare diseases make that entire landscape impossible for industry to be able to cover. And what we're seeing is an increase in the numbers of very small patient groups or patient organisations. They're not even necessarily at the stage of an organisation. Small groups of patients who are driving the science, who are driving the development of treatments. And we're talking about ultra rare diseases here. So they are not just part of the healthcare system, but driving the drug development process. The challenge for gene therapy at the moment is that we're driving towards single therapeutic areas, single diseases that can be treated with gene therapies. And that makes every single process very long-winded. And the real transformation will be scientific innovations that allow platform developments, that allow scalability and increased accessibility across a range of rare diseases. And that's where the science will really drive those innovations. And that will be a really big sea change in terms of the numbers of rare diseases that can be treated with gene therapy.
And I presume, therefore, that patient engagement is vital in that then, because if you get all the patient groups, rather than working individually but working collectively, that's going to help. I mean, I know both of you have a lot of work with patient groups, and patient engagement. Is there anything that you feel that needs to be done with relation to education, encouragement, support? Do you feel that could actually help with this?
Yeah, I think that, communities understand the need for a balance of sort of speed and evidence generation for gene therapy. And obviously the key to achieving that balance and sort of harmonisation among all the different stakeholders, including regulatory authorities and payers, is about giving the patient voice equal weight in the mix. But there are sort of unintended consequences in terms of, for particularly patient advocacy groups, about outstripping their sort of capacity, skills and resources to engage effectively. Patients and their families are often the same people who are leading and working for these advocacy groups, sometimes, unpaid in a voluntary capacity. So I think there is a burden on those groups that needs to be accounted for in terms of, again, bringing innovation through to market and that access piece.
It's that burden and the expertise that's required to deliver it. Recognising that those patient organisations are often set up to care and support. Their primary goal is often to ensure that there is community. And part of their work then has been driving towards a cure. So they are trying to cover a lot of different hats with very limited capacity. So what they're achieving is phenomenal when you look at the capabilities that some of these patient organisations or individual patients are achieving. Yeah. But the burden that places on them, as Laurence said, is significant.
It's interesting because one of the questions I wanted to ask you, Emma, was the fact that, with your role at UCB with patient engagement, how much weight do you put on the patient's education, and I'm trying to think of another word for engagement really, but the patient engagement in gene therapy? And from what you're saying, I think you're saying it's a heavy load, isn't it?
It's so fundamental to the process that what we're asking of the patients, we have to be very mindful that we don't place too big a load and that we support patients through that journey, patients and patient organisations, and that we understand where there may be gaps in experience or knowledge, where they may need additional support or education, and think about how that can be supported so that they can continue to be meaningfully involved throughout the continuum of the drug development process. It's very easy to work with a small number of people, but you have to think about whether that represents the entire community. So again, it's working out what the question is we're asking, who we need to work with within those organisations, and how we can balance that against the burden that places on them.
I mean, we're talking about, educating patients to engage them in the whole process of gene therapy. I imagine, you really have to go into an awful lot of detail so that people understand exactly what it is and how irreversible it is.
I think that's one of the challenges we face, is how deep do we need to go into the science to ensure that people can be very informed about the consequences. And it may be that they don't need the deep understanding of the science, that they need an appropriate level of understanding to understand what it means for them. What we do recognise with gene therapies is that it's a very broad term. It applies to different therapies delivered in different ways, some of them delivered quite uniquely for some disease areas. So we might be talking about an infusion of a gene therapy, which is very similar to how we might have treatments currently for cancer or leukemia or blood disorders. But we're also talking about direct-to-brain therapies, which means injecting a gene therapy directly into our brains. So the level of understanding is different between those different therapies. The level of risk is different between those different treatments. And therefore, the need to understand what patients need, that balance of existing treatments versus new treatments, and the risks they might be undertaking to engage with that gene therapy, especially in the early stages of clinical trials, are fundamental.
And the irreversibility of it, I'm presuming, Laurence.
Yeah, and I think that's where, when you think about the sort of multidisciplinary clinical setup, the role of the psychologist becomes really vital in terms of undertaking gene therapy, again, to kind of explore all those ideas and preferences with the individual and their family to ensure that this is the right decision for them. I think because of the irreversibility and also the inability to redose in some instances, where there could be a suboptimal outcome, there's this idea that's entered the lexicon around sort of buyer's remorse, whereby individuals may regret the decision to proceed with the sort of irreversible process. So I think it's just being really cognizant that obviously the decision making around gene therapy is very different to conventional therapeutics.
I must admit, the idea of having it into your brain is massive, isn't it?
It is, and we think about the brain in a way that is different to other organs in the body. There's this idea or sanctity, if you like, of around the brain that makes it very difficult for people to contemplate brain surgery if you have another option. Even if you do have another option, it's still a big undertaking. For gene therapy, we really need patients to consider taking that therapy very early on after diagnosis. And that diagnostic process may have been very prolonged, can be very challenging, because once you have a genetic diagnosis, you've got lots of repercussions for family members and others. Then you're talking about a decision to undertake gene therapy and for that to be delivered directly to your brain. And as well, we think about the brain as being where our essence is, of where our personalities are, and it's still really challenging for people to think about something that goes into your brain and can never be taken out again. And we need to recognise that that is something quite significant for some people to consider.
I think from what we've discussed so far, it seems that we are proving this hypothesis, but I think it's only fair that we should challenge it.
Yeah.
So let me just throw an idea. What about the ethical and social implications of this? I'm going to come to Laurence on this one, I think, first.
We've obviously touched on some of those ethical aspects because I think there are several that are unique to gene therapy. So we've discussed about managing patient expectations because of those remaining uncertainties, the risk-benefit ratio. And because of that, I think gene therapy raises significant questions around the informed consent process. Again, both in a kind of trial setting, but even consenting to treatment when, if and when it's available in clinic. And, I fundamentally believe patients everywhere have the right to information and self-determination, but their decisional capacity could be undermined, whether that's as a result of the extent of current disease burden or again, like we said, about current standard of care or lack of treatment, and also just the desire for improvement in health-related quality of life. So, and on top of that, I think there's lots of other factors, just in terms of how information is presented and framed, like we've said, around terminology, around cure and curative. I think primarily in terms of the social implications, that's in relation to cost effectiveness of gene therapy relative to standard of care. So essentially, is it value for money, and what is society willing to pay for it? But again, there is that kind of ethical dimension to that when we're thinking about rare disease communities. In terms of the argument around investing scarce resources in a smaller number of people, yet where there is a high unmet clinical need for which have been very underserved populations.
I mean, I think you touched on regulation very, very briefly before, Laurence, but Emma, coming to you, that is going to be one of the things, though, is how can you regulate such a system and policy as well for pharmaceutical companies, and then also a paradigm shift within the pharmaceutical industry.
We're in that paradigm shift. I think we're on a journey. I know we use that phrase quite a lot, but when you look at the evolution of patient engagement so far, it's definitely in a very different environment to where it was, but we still have to progress further. There is still a lack of clarity about how the patient voice really affects regulatory decisions, the decisions that are made by health technology assessors, the decisions that are made by payers. And that side of the healthcare system the drug development process is bringing the patient voice in, is paying greater attention to it, but it's not clear how it influences the decision making. It's not clear what's expected, and therefore it's very difficult to bring that back round to the patients and patient organisations to involve them effectively, because we can't see how their input ultimately is affecting decision.
Is there a way of measuring that?
That's the big question at the moment, is how we measure impact of the patient voice. There will be ways to capture it. I think it's a very active consideration at the moment for regulators and for assessors, is how we measure that. It's a very active question for industry at the moment, because involving patient communities is a must. But it takes resource, and it takes resource in terms of cost to ensure that people are appropriately remunerated for their time, which they give very willingly and would often give for free. But we need to ensure that they are recognised for that time and value that they give. It takes resource within the organisation. It takes time. We don't want to see it as, or it being perceived as, slowing down the drug development process, but actually it's fundamental to getting it right.
Yeah, and if I may add to this, I guess objectively outside of industry, I think, a shift has occurred in the way that sponsors sort of proactively seek to understand and incorporate the sort of preferences, the values, the needs and experiences of patient communities in the drug development process. I guess whether that's being done systematically is quite hard to say. I think it just comes back to that, again, that kind of principle of ensuring that patient communities and individual patients are seen and recognised as co-researchers in all development phases, whether that's sort of the planning, the execution, or just evidence dissemination. And we've seen a big movement, particularly the latter, in terms of plain language summaries, and how, again, we're translating the evidence and democratising that knowledge and understanding, particularly around gene therapies.
It's complicated science.
100%.
I think we're probably going to have to decide whether our hypothesis is realistic or not. Do you think it is a realistic hypothesis that the patient engagement is the most important element here? And if so, what do you want to see in the future?
I feel that there needs to be a really strong balance and interaction between the two. I think we need to continue to drive science. We need transformation in the science to ensure that we can reach the maximum number of patients, that we can have effective and safe therapies that deliver benefit. That's very much driven by the science. But we need to understand what patient communities need in terms of benefit. We need the patients to drive urgency and to inform when and how these therapies are best delivered. So there needs to be a strong collaborative approach to delivering this. So I think we need the two hand in hand, from the earlier stages of drug development through to delivery in the healthcare system.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that, the science underpinning the technology needs to be sound, but, again, without engaging with patient communities, sort of the added value of the long-term health benefits may not be truly realised.
Well, this is really interesting. Thank you both. I think we could have talked for much longer, but we will have to come to the end here, because that's the end of this particular episode. I'd like to thank my two guests, Dr. Emma Lane and Laurence Woollard. Thank you, both of you. Do you think we achieved this particular hypothesis? Do you think it's right that patient engagement is more important than the science in developing gene therapy? Let us know what you think. Until then, keep exploring science, keep thinking about things like this, and do come and watch us on our next one.